Chapter 20. Wowed. Hiccup's boots molded to the soft ground with every careful shift in his weight as he approached his mark. The thin layer of snow coating the hard earth would occasionally crunch under his footing, but otherwise his skill in silently navigating through winter-like conditions had not been lost on him. His breath would have been visible if the air was just a shade colder, and he found the night to be more perfect than any in recent memory. The old mountain was a blessing to him. His time in the Balkans caused freckles to bloom across his skin faster than the most infectious of plagues. Some clustered so close he looked of a whole other skin color. Toothless thought he was diseased for a while, first with the daily appearance of more freckles, and then with the peeling of skin from his sunburns. It took Hiccup nearly half a day to convince the Night Fury that humans did not shed their skin like snakes, and that he was not dying. These reassurances did not stop Hiccup from directing Toothless straight to the first snow-capped mountain they fell across in the range. He could clearly remember the first, almost magical burn of cold to his lungs, and recalled how he had thrown himself bare-backed into the snow. It was a glorious moment, his return to the cold. Hiccup shook his head, clearing the thoughts. He had a mission to complete, and he wasn't going to waste an entire day of reconnaissance just to rhapsodize over the wonderful climate. It took days of searching just to find a village established so high in the mountains, let alone one with a blacksmith. He rested his back against the wall of the shop and inched his way closer to the door. The full moon illuminated the village, both enhancing his mobility and aiding his vision, while hindering it by increasing his chances of being spotted. However, he wasn't entirely worried about that prospect. Of all the qualities he observed in the mountain-dwelling Bulgarians, the fear of being attacked was not among them. Thus, no night guards. And no lit windows, for that matter, nor smoking chimneys. Not even a whisper disturbed the night, and the moon had barely crested. Hiccup wouldn't complain. Their oddity was his boon. Hiccup didn't worry about the smith waking up to find him in the shop, as he had finally found a use for the dried opium poppy. After pinpointing where the smith lived, and waiting well into the night when he would surely be sleeping, Hiccup burned the poppy in a nickel clay bowl, fanning the smoke to get it flowing under the large space between the bottom of the door and the ground. From how Tundi explained their purpose, the effect should be strong enough to prolong and deepen one's slumber to the point of not waking during a vandal, which was what he needed. Once assured, the young traveler stole into the shop. He found a candle by the door, accompanied by a couple of spark rocks, and immediately set to lighting the room. It was set up differently than Gobber's, not nearly as practical for moving about, in Hiccup's personal opinion, but had many of the same appliances. He shrugged the satchel full of materials he collected off his shoulder and began to shift through the contents. He had reeds for the stem, stone that could be molded into pointed shapes, and a collection of feathers for fletching. He had no illusions of creating anything remotely like the Magyar design. This would be his first time actually crafting an arrow himself, but he only aimed to make something that could be fired. Hiccup set to work, optimistic in the number of arrows he would produce from all the materials he had gathered. But after spending half the night in the shop, attempting to muffle every sound he made, Hiccup ended up destroying more arrows than he created. If he didn't wet the rocks too far, then he broke the reeds in his trials at hafting. His frustration mounted with each failure, perhaps making his work even sloppier as he labored through supplies. Eventually, he had to stop when he ran out of materials for arrowheads. He looked down at the 5 technically launchable projectiles he had managed to produce and sighed heavily. Granted, it was his first time creating an arrow. Gobber certainly never taught him how, but he had hoped his skills as a blacksmith would give him a slight advantage. Maybe they had. Maybe arrows were one of the most difficult weapons to make. Or maybe those skills were rusting in his time away from the shop. He rubbed his face, giving a little more attention to his eyes that began to burn with fatigue. He'd have to cut his losses and be thankful he managed to make any at all. He could always buy them in the next town he came across. Certainly not this one, in case someone recognized him as the guy who... Hiccup paused in the midst of packing his supplies. Something had caught the candlelight and glinted at him from a darkened corner of the room. His chest tightened in dread for a moment as his mind flew through scenario after scenario of some hulking villager catching him in the act. Or worse, the smith, back with a vengeance for a stranger's attempt to drug and hoodwink him. But another second of straining his senses told Hiccup it was safe to approach, and he did so, only to find a collection of arrows. Hiccup let out such a breath of air that he had to wonder at the capacity of his lungs. Ignoring the sting of indignation over finding these now, after spending all the time and aggravation of creating his own, Hiccup counted his blessings that he would be able to leave with such a good yield after all. There were so many of them, piled upon each other like firewood stocked for a hard winter, that filling his own needs would not put a crippling dent in the supply. This village must have practiced archery as well. Hiccup picked a few of them up to test their weight. They were of a simple craft, but out of practicality and not cheapness. The heads were heavier than he was used to practicing with, longer and thicker, and were probably meant for hunting large animals. There must have been a surplus of sorts, with the way the arrows were tucked away under the table like an unfinished project. Hiccup looked at the surface of the table, where scraps of lustrous metals were scattered around like the smith suddenly had to leave. An arrow lay amidst the clutter. It would have looked like any of the others, aside from the silver-coated head. People didn't hunt animals with silver-tipped arrowheads. What was the point? Why decorate the part that would end up in a body? Most would decorate the shaft. He shrugged. It didn't matter to him how fancy an arrow was, so long as it did its job. He added it to the satchel of stolen goods anyway, and finished cleaning up, making sure to leave no trace of his activities aside from a shorter candle and a dent in the arrow supply. Hiccup exited the shop and stepped into the bright moonlight, sweeping his eyes across the silent streets one last time. He took a breath of the cool air, enjoying the crispness of the mountain frost for the umpteenth time. He was almost skeptical about how easy that was, the sneaking and the smithing, but again couldn't be bothered with it in light of his mood and his steel. Perhaps living in the mountains made one a naturally heavy sleeper. "Toothless?" Hiccup called when he reached their camp. It wasn't too far from the village, almost within visual distance, but after being in the town and not causing a stir, Hiccup felt no need to keep his voice down. He noticed the black hulking mass freeze. Hiccup perceived a distinct feeling of guilt from the other male. "Toothless, turn around." The dragon shifted around a bit, still keeping his back to Hiccup. The details of what Toothless was doing were sketchy at best, even under the full moon and blinding white snow. Finally, Toothless turned around, his ears perked cutely and his cheeks suspiciously puffed out. "Hi, Hiccup. Get your arrows?" Hiccup would not be fooled. There were bits of fluff around Toothless's mouth. "Toothless!" he snapped, and the dragon had the good sense to look contrite. "Did you eat someone's sheep again?" "No," the dragon insisted. His paw indiscreetly pushed a leftover hoof under the snow. Hiccup gave Toothless a long, hard look until the other's ears wilted. "Sorry, but they're just so tasty." "Honestly," Hiccup exhaled rather dramatically, though he may have just liked breathing the mountainous air that lacked all the humidity of river shores. "I told you, in settlements like these, every sheep matters." "You're mad I didn't save you any." Hiccup chose to ignore that comment, as he didn't quite know if he'd be able to sincerely deny it. "Besides, we're leaving soon, so I won't be tempted, right?" Realizing he would never really be able to stop Toothless from stealing sheep, Hiccup conceded. Yeah, we should be reaching the Iskar any day now, and then we'll be out of the mountains and back into Muspelheim." "Drama queen?" Toothless scoffed as he trotted behind Hiccup. "You don't know what that means," Hiccup sang back. "Glutton." "But I'm still using it, right? Toothless grinned. He observed the clutch of arrows Hiccup set aside as he tried to make room in his basket for them. "Those look relatively normal." Hiccup pursed his lips, both at the comment and at his inability to find enough room in the bulging pack for more gear. "I, didn't," he coughed, "strictly speaking, make most of these." He grabbed the biggest, heaviest object in the basket and yanked it out, upending several articles of clothing and various money sacks in the process. "Why do you still have that?" Toothless sighed, giving the axe a look of the deepest loathing. Hiccup's face was unreadable, his stare blank and unfocused as he drew the axe up to a better angle in the light.
I don't know, but I can't just abandon it here.
It had somehow become a background item, like he knew it was there, but never acknowledged it as something to ever be used. It hadn't left the pack since the first night of his self-imposed exile. His lips twitched, possibly to smile, possibly to grimace, and he stood from his crouch, bringing the weapon with him. He gingerly tested its weight with unforeseen ease and began to toss it from hand to hand. It was a well-balanced weapon. He had balanced it. He remembered that now. He had broken it by accident, too enthralled with having Astrid in proximity, and allowed the blade to chip on the spinning stone, forcing him to replace and rebalance the entire head. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. What had he been thinking? Allowing a girl to distract him like that while he was handling blades? Hiccup gave the axe a small swing by the handle. He could also remember the difficulty in maneuvering it with 2 hands. Holding it now, he couldn't imagine being hunched over at the weight of a simple axe. He briefly wondered, had he stayed on the island, would he be able to swing it as he could now? Probably not. His time in the smithy may have bugged him up a bit by now, but the entire island was too stifling for him to ever thrive. As opposed to here and the Balkans, drugging smiths and judging his process by the standards of an axe. He started ahead at the clear outline of a tree, dimly detailed in the bright night. "What are you doing?" Toothless asked, sounding a tad apprehensive. Something about Hiccup holding an axe and looking pensive put him on edge. Raising the axe up, over and beyond his shoulder, Hiccup swung forward, mimicking everything he'd ever seen Vikings do, and released it on the downswing. It went awry, just barely hitting the tree he was aiming for, but much higher than he intended. "What was that?" Toothless hissed, practically spitting at the boy. Hiccup, with an uncontrolled axe, was worse than he imagined.
"I never threw an axe before,"
Hiccup yelled in his defense, stomping over to retrieve the weapon. He yanked it out of the tree, realizing he must have overcompensated on the shoulder power.
"I figured it was the same concept as throwing a dagger, spinning blade and all that, but it's completely weighed differently."
"Oh, just bury it in the snow."
"I can't,"
Hiccup bemoaned, returning to his supplies and dropping the axe with contempt. He knew he was being unreasonable, but he couldn't help how he felt.
"I can't just leave it. It doesn't belong here. It needs to be back with Vikings."
"You are giving life to a weapon. Stop it. Besides, you just said you have no room for it." The howl of a wolf pierced any argument Hiccup may have made. Or was it a wolf? Something sounded wrong to Hiccup. It was deeper, more guttural than he thought possible, but most definitely canine. Its ring echoed amidst the depressions between the old mountain peaks, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint where it originated and causing goosebumps to run errand along Hiccup's arms. Not that he was scared. Even if he didn't have Toothless at his side, he wasn't completely defenseless anymore.
"I guess the wolves run bigger out here, just like the dragons."
The boy snorted and set to busying himself with fitting everything in the pack once more. It was a fruitless endeavor. The basket was at its limit. Toothless lightly biffed the top of Hiccup's head with his tail. "First of all, you're a diseased snake. Second, those are not natural wolves." Hiccup turned in his crouch, one hand on his hip and a wry smile on his lips.
"Making them what? Stuffed wolves?"
Toothless shook his head and looked to the east where more trees were knotted in tandem, a likely place for predators to dwell. The smile fell from Hiccup's face as he realized Toothless's pupils were constricted sharply in the restricted lighting. "I've seen them many times back with my drove. The humans called them adlets."
"Adlets,"
Hiccup tried the word. It didn't sound scary enough for something that just made that noise. "They're more powerful than wolves, faster too, and they hunt humans to drink their blood. They're even known to eat each other." Hiccup didn't know if this was true or if Toothless was trying to mess with him. He still couldn't get rid of the goosebumps, no matter how much he tried to discreetly rub his arms. Toothless must have noticed Hiccup's unease because he gifted the human with a gummy smile. "Luckily for us, They don't like fire.
And you don't know for sure if these are the same thing, these, adlets, right?
Another howl sounded just after he said this time louder, closer, and accompanied by a few varying tones of growls. If not, then a very close relative.
Maybe we should pack up,
Hiccup muttered, all too aware of how unconfident he sounded. Surprisingly, Toothless consented. We should. I don't know how many of them there are, and they are closer than what I'm comfortable with.
Don't need to tell me twice,
Hiccup said, and he redoubled his efforts to fit everything into the basket. He gave up soon enough, instead slinging the satchel full of arrows over his shoulder. It would probably prove to be more beneficial to have them at the ready anyways, even if it was a pain in the ass to have so many things hanging off him as he flew. He took the time to string his bow as well, just in case. We need to get in the air, Toothless announced with an urgency that had Hiccup all but throwing the saddle over his back. Every trace of calm was gone from the dragon, and Hiccup knew this meant these adlets were practically hounding them. A horrible growl startled Hiccup into missing the buckle for one of the saddle straps. He looked around Toothless to find something out of his nightmares.
What is that?
Hiccup breathed. It certainly wasn't a wolf, not like one he'd ever seen. This was far too large for one, more than half the size of Toothless, and its body could only be described as disfigured for a wolf. Normal wolves didn't have such human-like muscles shaping the matted fur. As it stalked out from the shadows of the trees, it moved as something that was hunched and using its arms to aid walking rather than the ease of a four-legged creature. Hiccup could sense the movement further beyond the wolf monster, heard the growls overlay, and somehow he knew there were more of them. It was still a pack animal. Hiccup? Hiccup shook his head, forcing his vision to tunnel on the straps and ignore the horrifying monster heading his way.
I'm going.
Fingers finally under control, Hiccup just managed to get the saddle strapped correctly when Toothless darted away from his reach. Hiccup's surroundings came back to him, and he witnessed Toothless intercepting the lead adlet that had suddenly made it to them in no time. They were fast. Hiccup blew a plasma bolt at the beast while it was mid-pounce. It struck the muscled stomach and it thrashed, helplessly, still airborne, pitching a long, high whimper. Toothless followed through his own fire to catch the adlet around the middle and crunch down on its ribs. Hiccup winced at the sharp crack, already pulling his bow from his back. He knocked the first arrow he drew from the satchel and steadied it at the quickly encroaching followers. There were at least a dozen of them, large and hulking and slinking towards Toothless with far more wary movements than the first. The quick disposal of the leader must have put them off enough to slow down, but not to back off completely. They still hungered for something. Toothless roared, much like he had when he first met Hiccup, a resonating, archaic sound that inspired foreboding. A few of the adlets scooted backwards, ears down and recognizing a superior creature. The rest continued to scurry forwards. Accursed mongrels! Toothless shot out 2 high-powered fireballs, sending several more of the creatures scampering back with startled yelps. The snowy ground would have made shooting fire far less effective if it weren't dragon fire, which could linger on material longer after others would smother to a flame. The blazing barrier caused a long cease in the adlet's advance, and for a moment Hiccup felt his hope flare, thinking the fire would be enough to send the creatures running. And then they were moving again, spurred into motion rather than retreat. Hiccup caught a glimpse of bloodshot golden eyes bulging in the firelight as the beasts began dashing around the flames as though they were intent on destroying them. Saliva flew from their mouths in long strings like infected animals. They were possessed by evil, charging, unthinking, at the pair despite being obviously outclassed by a dragon. Somewhere in their savage minds lay the comprehension that they had numbers on their side. Hiccup fired off an arrow, catching one in the neck halfway through a leap and throwing it backwards, before his bow was loaded once more. The downed creature only left an imprint in the snow and was back on its feet, blood dribbling around the neck wound and staining the snow. It may have attacked again, but Toothless finished it off with a quick fireball straight to the face and a swipe of his paw that nearly took its head off. Hiccup didn't have time to react to the horror of realizing how hard they would be to kill. He had to shoot back another one a second later. "Don't let them bite you. They're diseased," Toothless ordered. Hiccup wouldn't have let them bite him anyway, diseased or not. They could probably kill him with the first mouthful. Toothless did his part in leaping from monster to monster, often disabling them with one good crunch and being careful with choosing how to use his firebolts. Hiccup stayed back, knowing he was at a disadvantage with his soft, human flesh and poor vision in the night. Instead, he fired off his newly made and stolen arrows, aiming for the most vital points and guessing where an adlet would be at the time the arrow hit by gauging their speed and movements. He felt cautious of his role. Toothless moved fast, and though his dark hide gave him an advantage in taking out prey, Hiccup couldn't help but be hesitant in his firing for fear of accidentally hitting his friend. His practice with the Magyars specialized in targeting stationary targets while moving himself. Now he faced the opposite. He only had his talent for quick deduction and calculating a target's future position. But the monsters were resilient, and that it took several arrows to keep one down, and Hiccup soon realized he was running low on ammunition. He couldn't rely on Toothless to take down every adlet he maimed. The dragon was already occupied in his own flurry of movements, trying to keep the adlets far enough from Hiccup for the human's arrows to be effective. Though the rush of warring bodies may give the illusion of a quick scuffle, Hiccup's rushing blood and racing mind seemed to put the world in slow motion. In a way it helped. He felt he had the time to focus on his precision, and an odd sort of detachment befell him that helped him keep his head. He wasn't sure how much time had passed before there were at least 10 bodies littering the reddened snow, with more still dancing around the flames. Hiccup did, however, acknowledge that the commotion they participated in should have been impossible to ignore. The absolute ruckus of these bellowing hounds, the range of sensational blue fire covering the ground, all of these should have stirred at least some attention from the village. And yet, somehow, Hiccup better understood why the community seemed so oddly shut down. The locals knew of these creatures. Toothless was backing up towards him slowly, even as he fought off the adlets, and Hiccup picked up on the silent opening to hop on the saddle. It would be for the best, Hiccup realized, as he grabbed the last arrow in his quiver, the heaviest he had yet to fire. He bit his lip, sparing a moment to glance at the metal-coated tip, and took aim. This one had to count. The 3 remaining adlets charged Toothless at once. The dragon whacked one back with his tail, biting at another with his teeth, catching it clear around the neck, and the third got blasted back in the chest by Hiccup's last arrow. A single arrow to the chest wasn't enough to kill them. Hiccup knew this by now, but surely it would buy Toothless enough time. A howl of supreme agony erupted from the pierced adlet. Hiccup jumped. He watched it writhe on the ground, screaming like no other creature should scream. Smoke rose from the arrow wound, the hiss of cooking flesh drowned out by the monster's misery, but not the smell, which hit Hiccup even more from where he stood, and he had to fight down a lurching stomach. The full moon gave Hiccup a clear vision of what was happening, and, though a nauseating picture, he found he couldn't take his eyes off of it. The fur of the adlet's chest started to melt inward at the entry point of the wound, the damage circled out like the ripples in a pond. Skin and fur and flesh sinking down as molten wax would, blackening, curling and evaporating, until all that was left of the wretch was a twisted frame of bloody, fur-matted bones. Hiccup continued to stare, his mouth open, forgetting to breathe, yet unwilling to take in the air that was just exposed to that. "Hiccup!" Hiccup hadn't heard the adlet coming in his awe of witnessing such a horrific process. He turned in time to see the last hair-raising beast descending on him, not an arm's length away from him with his long maw open and tongue curled back. Hiccup's brain really only registered teeth and death. He hardly had time to scream, let alone fire an arrow he did not have. Hiccup managed to hold the bow out in front of him, using it to occupy the beast's mouth in place of what would have surely been his head. The mighty jaw snapped down on it, the jarring vibrations of the bite shaking the very bones of the arm holding it. The adlet would have landed on him too, if a force of black wrath didn't sidesweep it from its intent. Hiccup stumbled to the ground, hearing the crash of 2 larger bodies hit the snow next to him. Instinctively, he rolled away from the clash. The savage snarls quelled in the next instant, and Hiccup, gasping heavily, scrambled back to his feet to find Toothless giving the unmoving and heavily bleeding body a deserving strike for good measure.
"Is that the last of them?"
Hiccup cried, his eyes wide and wild. He turned his head every which way, to the trees, to the village. Nothing moved, aside from the remains of Toothless's flames. In fact, everything seemed too calm after all that. He just experienced it, and Hiccup already had trouble believing such an intense and terrifying scuffle happened at all. It was so fast, with so little warning, already a memory. Hiccup placed a hand on his thumping chest, willing his heart to slow. And as it slowed, his heated body began to shake as the last of his energy left him. Time came back to him, reality came back to him. "Yeah," Toothless responded gruffly. "There aren't any left." He spit a stray ember clinging to the back of his throat down at the adlet he had just trounced. He recalled fighting such creatures with his brethren long ago, before the demon, back when he only cherished his pride in standing. It was a game then, dangerous and stupid and full of posturing. Fighting when he had something to protect took much of the fun out of such pastimes, and no matter how much he wanted to dredge up old feelings of triumph, standing over the bodies he downed, he was only conscious of unrelenting relief, and the lingering itch of fear that still scraped against the inside of his chest. They had gotten so close to him. The dragon shook his head and tried to stamp out the ridiculous emotions of concern that insisted on remaining in the wake of a victory. Hiccup was fine, and they defeated the adlets. There was no sense in feeling this way.
"We should still leave,"
Hiccup announced, unable to hide his weariness. His body managed to experience a combination of heaviness and jitters, and he just wanted to curl up next to Toothless to sleep, but not here. Hiccup began the slow trudge back to his belongings, some of which ended up scattered around their side, thanks to the unwelcome visitors. He weaved around incomplete carcasses, occasionally bending to pick something up, unable to feel pity for the brutality of their ends, and unable to work up a suitable queasiness for the carnage they left behind. He really was too exhausted to feel anything aside from mild irritation. It had simply happened. They were attacked, and they survived. There was nothing more to it. His feet eventually took him back to Toothless's side, who stared at the splintered remains of the bow Damocles gave him. Hiccup joined him in the silent comprehension of the previously unaccounted victim. "Wow," Toothless finally uttered. Beside him, Hiccup shook his head.
"It didn't even last 2 months, and it's already—"
"Wow," Toothless repeated. Hiccup looked at him.
"Do you even know what that means?"
"Possibly, but it sounds right for the circumstances." Hiccup tried it out himself.
"Wow."
And somehow he felt he could accept the loss of the bow much easier now, having voiced his sentiments on the matter. "At least you can fit the axe in now." "Damn it, Hiccup, stop bouncing on my back."
"I can't help it. We're almost there."
Hiccup knew he was behaving far too excitable for someone his age, but the anticipation of finally seeing the walls of Miklagard was too great for him to contain. Jitters plagued him all morning. They had left the last of the Maritsa River 2 weeks ago, heading straight east to the fork where the river turned completely south. On Hiccup's insistence, they took less and less breaks as they approached the great city, covering more ground than they usually would. They still took the time to practice some blindfolded flying, but without a bow it had lost some of its effect. The loss of his weapon had put a bit of a damper on the boy's feelings of security. He still had his dagger, and he still had his dragon, but his hand-to-hand combat consisted of a mixed visual collection of wrestling with Toothless. He actually felt a little naked without the feeling of the weapon at his back. Not that he admitted such to Toothless, lest he be subjected to some misunderstood and inappropriate humor. But now that they were on the cusp of reaching Miklagard, his spirits were lifted. He had wanted to see the waltz his grandfather spoke of for as long as he could remember, and he was making it happen, on his own terms. And he could buy a new bow there, and arrows, and a bigger pack, and materials to upgrade Toothless's saddle. "We should have waited a bit before setting off. It's too likely we'll be spotted if we keep flying in the light like we've been." Toothless didn't sound worried, more exasperated that Hiccup's boyish excitement could get them in trouble. The sun had barely begun to set, making them as a clear silhouette to even the most aged eye. The farther they moved away from the inland, the closer they came to bodies of water, and with water came greater gatherings of humans. The greatest gathering, if what he heard of Miklagard was true. How to deal with that many humans and a Night Fury was something to be figured out later, after he saw the walls.
"After this, we'll only travel after dark,"
Hiccup promised. After all, he didn't want to be responsible for any misfortune because he momentarily lost his head over a silly ambition. And then he remembered that some greater power out there hated him. Hiccup didn't quite know how it happened or when or where they were positioned in the air for it to even be possible. One minute they were flying, making casual plans for their journey as they always did, and then the next his ears were occupied by a whooshing. A potent, deafening whooshing before the power of Thor's hammer slammed into his side. The pain was numbing and too sudden for him to feel anything but disorder at the first moments of suspension. He was wrapped. He couldn't move his foot. Oil and twine filled his nostrils, not quite overpowering, but enough to make him dizzy. The sensation of uncontrolled falling rushed his stomach. He couldn't feel Toothless's wings beating at his heels anymore. And as the descent started to pick up speed, Hiccup's brain finally caught up with the situation. He placed what had ensnared them. He understood. They were spotted, they were targeted, and they were caught. And he knew the ground was coming up to meet them at a dangerous velocity.
"Toothless!"
he gasped, needing to know his companion was still with him. He was being pushed against the netting as the Night Fury struggled against the bindings.
"Hiccup!"
Toothless mirrored his distress, and Hiccup was suddenly reminded that Toothless had experienced this at least once before, that he had the misfortune of knowing what was to come if they didn't free themselves soon. Hiccup tried to reach for the dagger at his belt, but found himself too confined to move his arms enough. Toothless fired a plasma bolt the best he could, trying to burn through at least one end of the net and not caring what got struck in the process. It sort of worked, snapping a couple knots directly in front of the dragon's face, but whatever oil coated the ropes made them resistant to burning quickly. Instead, the fire clung to the bindings, adding a heat that Hiccup could barely feel thanks to the terror swiftly sweeping over his mind. Hiccup felt Toothless trying to twist in the air, preparing to hit the ground belly down. The ground that was suddenly right there.
"Toothless, don't!"
The rest of Hiccup's sentence cut off as they made contact with the unforgiving earth.
"Don't try to protect me. This is my fault. Don't die for me. Don't make me live without you. I don't want to live without you."